Seamus Heaney, Ireland's most admired poet since Yeats, is known throughout the English-speaking world. The eldest of 9 children, he was born in 1939 and raised on a farm in Northern Ireland. The first in his family to go beyond grade school, Heaney completed his studies on scholarship at Queen's University, Belfast, remaining there to teach through the turbulent 1960s. By 1972, the year he moved south from troubled Ulster to the Republic of Ireland, Heaney's first 3 books of poems had appeared to growing critical acclaim. The London Times praised his luminosity, an almost literal resurrection of the world through language, while Robert Lowell, praising Heaney's 4th book, North, in 1975, called it a new kind of political poetry. Fieldwork, More Poems, followed in 1979. Preoccupations, a book of essays, in 1980. Sweeney Astray, a translation of the medieval Irish saga, in 1984. Station Island in 1985, and The Hall Lantern in 1987. Governance of the Tongue, a 2nd book of essays, is due out soon. Seamus Heaney now lives in Dublin with his wife and 3 children. 1 semester each year he teaches in the United States at Harvard. Talking on a winter day in Maryland with George O'Brien of Georgetown University, here is Seamus Heaney.
The country I grew up in was, I thought of it and still think of it as ordinary. It was flat. There was a mountain called Steve Gallen, a little mountain on the horizon, and then further along there were the Spirins. But it was very much farmland, hedges, by roads. There was a main road, as we called it, and a railway. Our house was between the railway and the main road. But it was tremendously secure, I suppose. First of all, we had a farm, so the fields on each side were our own, and we knew everybody within, the radius of 3 miles. You knew what each field was. So it's true that it is, in terms of fields and in terms of a small topography, that my sense of the world developed, and the other thing is, as well as the space factor, I think what was important in terms of where it comes from, you say, in terms of writing, is that after 12, 13 years, that first still place, where I lived, for 12 years, until I went to St. Colum's College in Derry, I hadn't gone beyond Ballymena or Cookstown, 12 miles this way, 13 miles that way. Then my first trip to Derry was 40 miles away, and my father's friend Jim McKenna had a motor car. So that was a big expedition. The first day at boarding school, we crossed the mountain to Derry, and then when they had gone that far, of course, to Derry, which was still in the north of Ireland, they felt they should cross the border. So we went for the afternoon to Buncrana in Donegal, and that's where they bought the biscuits that they gave me. They went away back home, and I was and therefore my career as a boarding school, as an exile, had begun. So it's terrific heartbreak, homesickness, blah blah, all that. But then 2 years after that, the place where I grew up, we moved. We moved from that home only for 4 or 5 miles in terms of space, but it's a completely different home world. So when I started to write, the lid came off this first 12 years, and as it was all preserved. It was perfectly fragrant and still. I think that we've become more and more and more aware, because of the kind of critical thinking and writing that has become prevalent. Writers have become much more aware that what they write is writing. It isn't the thing. It isn't what you remember. It is language. It is a text. It is an invention, in the Latin sense of invention as well. You come upon a thing. you find it. But then you find it, where do you find it? But it comes out as words. There's a definition of inspiration which I like very much. It's by a Polish woman poet called Anna Swir, S-W-I-R. There's a book of hers published recently called Happy as a Dog's Tail. And she has this to say. She said, inspiration, she says, I take it to be a psychosomatic phenomenon which gives, as it were, the poem a biological right to exist. And it's that feeling which certainly lyric poets crave and all writers need. That feeling that the work has a biological right to exist, that's most important. And to go back to the place element, to go back to origin and all that, I found that when I was thinking of those places or situating a poem in those first places, first physical places, first emotional places, that it felt it had a right to live, you know, and it tended to generate a life and energy of its own. And I suppose I've made that into almost a superstition then. I mean, that my function was to write out of and over that domain. First of all, the place, the physical place, the farm in Derry, the little place. And then the place I belonged to was the place where my speech belonged to, on the whole, Ireland. I extended from Mossbawn, from the farm, not into Ulster, although I belong to Ulster too, but there's an ideological problem comes up immediately. But I extended into Ireland. We listened to BBC, of course, but we also listened to our Radio Éireann, as it was called. Yeah. But it was called Athlone.
Athlone, is right.
Which is the translator was. Yes. So in the north of Ireland in the 40s, you had the Catholic population listening in across the border to Athlone, to the Irish broadcasting station, and a lot of our life was unthinkingly a resistance to the dominant cultural and political mode. I'm not saying that our family were rebellious. I mean, they were placid, sluggish even, but without thinking about it, the resistance was there. Workers, I mean, it's a very interesting double take that you were living completely within the orbit of the BBC. Here is the news. I mean, that big, strong, magnificent tread of the Raytheon machine,
right, yeah.
You know, and the weather forecast. You know, here is the weather forecast.
But
there were two worlds. There was the British world and the Irish world, and you espoused the Irish world, but you were deeply affected by the British world too. And those kinds of thoughts, of course, don't come into the poetry at all in the first bit, in the first book. The first book is kind of pastoral of a sort, I suppose. But gradually, as you inspect yourself, and certainly as my beginning as a writer coincided with the beginning of the disruptions in the north of Ireland, and all the political, historical, cultural rethinking and self-examination that went on between 1965 and 1985, say, was coterminous with a certain development from Aladdin's 20s to Aladdin's 40s. So we thought probably too much about it, you know, I feel now. Yeah. About it being British or Irish or Ulster or whatever, you know.
Well, yeah, but there's a kind of freedom in that too, because I thought that's, you know, in Death of a Naturalist, the first book, that's really what the subject of the book is, in a sense. It's not so much the landscape or the absence of scenery or what have you. It's the human enterprise of farming.
Yes.
and cultivation and tending and things elapsing in their own natural time and so on. And I often wonder whether you think of retitling that book "Birth of a Humanist."
Well, Death of a Naturalist is a very, a catchy title, and it was done without much responsibility. I didn't even think, I like the ring of it.
Yeah.
And so then there's it has, fortunately in one way, it has had to bear much scrutiny, and so then, you begin to write yourself into existence and write yourself out of existence at the same time. When the book was being published, this was astonishing in the first place, to be accepted. And then they send you these forms saying, anything, tell us something about the book, why you chose the title, what you want to say about it. So I'm making up things like, it was true, but there were, it was only part of the truth. This book is about the removal from an agricultural background to an academic background of somebody whose ancestors worked the land but who now works in the university himself, blah, blah. It's true. But at the same time, I wasn't really removed, I was going home every weekend. I still go home. I'm as illiterate as the next, I go to I go with my brothers. There are so many languages we all speak in our lives, and so many domains of reality that we can enter. So while it is true, we can sit here, we could go further than we've gone yet into books. Other people's books,
yes, sure.
And you can talk that, but it doesn't necessarily alienate you in any disruptive emotional way. It alienates you once you become to consciousness. That's enough alienation.
All right.
But you can move into the farm. I'm quite happy. I'm never more happy, than back in that milieu with the smell of it and so on.
Yeah.
So I was saying, remove Death of a Naturalist, the end of somebody at home in their environment moving out, was true, but it was untrue, As a writer, what you're doing first and foremost is in the words of Joseph Brodsky, getting a boost from the language. You write for the pleasure of it, and my pleasures were originally derived as a reader from writing like Keats and Hopkins, which gave me a certain kind of boost. It made my mouth water, or that gave me goose flesh. I wanted a kind of sensuous fullness. So the places and the people that are there they're also places and presences that allowed that richness, that generated that thing in the language itself to begin with. So there was a kind of hedonistic, self-indulgent quality to writing about all that too,
Yes, but our freedom.
Or freedom. That's this question of language and we say alienation and poems, what they are, and how work that seems to have a community basis belongs to a community or a group. It's all extremely interesting, and alas, the notion that writing belongs to the community is completely untrue. We can simulate it, but actually it belongs nowhere,
You think so?
So let me put it extremely. I'm working against certain evidences here, but fundamentally a poem exists. When you said freedom, you put me onto this kick. It exists to be itself, and the enormous freedom, the joy of feeling that it has got there, which lasts for about half a second, but that is surely why we do it, the sentence which completes itself. It's a sexual annihilation and delight. Through, finished, but you have to start again. And so fundamentally, like the poem, to take it because it's a unit and quick, the poem exists for itself. Now, when I go home to County Derry, back to the neighbours, back, you know, say it's 1968 or 9, local farmers say, I hear you've published a book of poems. I suppose you'll be making a poem about me next, you know. So,
Yeah.
you know, watch yourself here with this boy. He'll be writing about you, you know. Then they say, well, you say it's one of them poems. And the enormous embarrassment, you know, what you expect. And I mean, my voice changes anyway when I go to read a poem because it's a formal thing, and you go. So you realize, okay, you say a poem at digging, like that's very direct. My father digging. Somehow it's okay, but if you stand up among even, by God, among your own family and say it, you know, you realize the enormous distance between the thinginess and the itness and the otherness of the poem and the other kind of commands and demands and relationships that are there in domestic and social reality, you know. And somehow you standing between the itness of the thing and the verity of your relationship, you're bound to be, you're embarrassed as hell, you know. You're neither one thing nor the other.
But you never thought of saying to these neighbours what John McGahern said to his neighbours, the Irish novelist John McGahern. Once he assured his neighbours that there was no money in writing, they accepted it fine. That was proof that he hadn't changed, you know.
No, but that's another thing that, of course, they don't believe that.
Right.
Once you have a book published, and certainly once you appear on television, you know.
Oh, you're a made man then.
Yeah, it is assumed. It is assumed, or it was assumed, if your face had appeared on a BBC screen, that man was making a fortune.
Yes. They wouldn't talk to you on the BBC otherwise, right?
Yeah.
But you retained the land, but you left the land in a way too. And I mean, not just biographically, but kind of within the idiom of the poetry. And water started to have, what could you say, an effect.
I didn't make any conscious poetical decision about the elements of water, but I just, as a biological creature, or as a planetary creature of the planet and the cosmic conditions, an enormous attraction to wet places, you know. And I always envied, even in language, you know, before you actually see a thing, you know, sometimes certain language creates its own reality for you. I mean, the word fen, you know.
Yes.
No. I mean, I didn't know what a fen was, but I really liked the idea of it. I also envied certain landscapes, reeds. I never could see reeds, you know. There were things called rushes.
Yes.
And there was segans, as they were called, kind of sedge, short,
right.
broad thing. But reeds, it was so literary, you know. Well, bulrushes we could see, but they were unattainable.
Yeah.
They were always out on a soft, treacherous part, and you couldn't get to them. So it's true that the soggy, wet, marshy, boggy was it was part of the imaginative attraction. I mean, one says this with hindsight, but it was a fact. And when I walked to school, we used to walk up through I suppose, a bog, a moss as we call it. Lots of water hens and big cranes, and a sort of secrecy and stillness about it. And then you see a water hen with the little ones behind it. But as I say, the relationship between whatever happened and whatever you were was natural and attractive to you, and whatever goes on in the poems is an accidental one quite often.
But do you think you're in your element now that you've taken to the air? This is one of the things that's happened. You were advised to do so by the spirit of James Joyce, is it not so? This is in Station Island when you're told to let go, let fly, and off with you.
Yeah, well, we all know that's the correct advice. And
especially from Daedalus.
Yeah. There's a beautiful description of a blacksmith. There's a Middle English poem about blacksmiths, kind of about battering and blattering and so on, and they are described as being water burners.
Oh boy, that's a good one. Yes.
But on an analogy with that, Osip Mandelstam, the Russian poet, described poets as being, or as the best poets, as being air stealers, stealers of air. Oh. And I suppose that having done all the sludge, I wouldn't mind doing the air, but I think some creatures are born to fly and others are born to, muck about it. And speaking of air, this is an equivalent of air. I use the word soul,
That's dodgy.
Well, but I wouldn't have.
Yeah, right.
In the beginning, you're afraid. You think, oh my God, no, so abstract and so papistical.
Yes.
And,
yes.
So you wouldn't do it, and then you begin to say, with that, there's a certain part of you, especially if that space had been packed and packed and packed with doctrine and Catholicism, when your whole being was actually just inseparable from the faith, a faith. Then you secularize yourself, because that's what you have to do. You're living in the world. You necessarily live the life of your generation. You live the life of the world you're in. The world that you were given is out of kilter with the world that you're in, so you secularize yourself. So then you say, but damn it all, there's something else.
Yeah.
So that's where the air comes in, I think, and the soul and the emptiness. It's that wonderful moment that you cross when you say, okay, there's nothing here except what we make up. And I mean, I like it in writers, like when Yeats gets to the point where he does the Hawk's Well,
yes,
at the Hawk's Well, where the well is both dry, the well is dry, but it fills at a certain point and then you miss it. Or Beckett's Krapp's Last Tape,
That's right.
The old man listening to the young man on the tape. And it's also one of the fullest plays, because the description of the lovemaking in the boat where rocks among the reeds. And yet, he's scorning the young man and enormously attracted to it. So I think that the airiness, I mean, the mud and the water and so on are reliable, frog-spun, sensual, growing elements. And I think air is more the element for disappearing, getting ready for the end. But I've become more and more interested in the Catholicism, not as a sectarian, sociological dimension of life in the North, but as Catholicism as a condition which is, in a sense, archaic in the modern world, and in a sense been banished from the English language. For a writer who uses English, since the Renaissance, English language, the English imagination through its language, the imagination of the English language, everyone say, it has been gradually trying to get rid of all that stuff, It has reformed itself. It is a reformed language. and so that it's unconscious. It doesn't have an unconscious now that holds, like the Virgin Mary or St. Bridget's Cross, or that if you get Chaucer's language, if you get Shakespeare's language has a Catholic unconscious, But if you get Wordsworth's language, it doesn't have, you know. And Wordsworth's a creature who has a reverent streak in him, you know, and who meets the goddess, if you like. But there's nothing goddessy about it. There's no Virgin Mary. There's no Queen Mab. You know, it's gone. When I read in translation, for example, Polish poetry of the Poles, I'm interested in them because they are as hard-bitten and suspicious as we are in Ireland.
Yeah.
They also have, even though they may have, in a sense, lost their faith, their language still is possessed of that which they have lost, you know. And that if a Catholic writes about, you only have to think of the Catholic writers in English. Very few. I mean, Joyce and Hopkins, for example. How odd it is for the usual English. There's an opaque, there's a resistance there to the English ear. I don't mean just the racially English, but to American ear. Catholicism is odd. If you grew up inside it, then you in a sense, you divest yourself of something of your essential nature or vocabulary in order to become, to disguise yourself as one of them, you know?
Yeah.
Certainly in poetry, I mean, if you think of T.S. Eliot and a poem like Ash Wednesday, because I do not hope to turn again, because I do not hope desiring this man's gift and that man's scope, you know, and so on. It's very, it's a kind of, it's high Anglicanism rather than Roman Catholicism. But it's a shape that satisfies us whose minds were set up for purgation, you know, breastfeeding, illumination, self-affliction, you know, and all that kind of ascetic self-denial stuff, which was the whole formation, you realize more and more. My generation in north of Ireland especially had to deal with this. As I say, we all had our books published around about the same time as the cameras arrived.
Yeah.
You know, television cameras. The writers from they were cubs, you know, in their 20s, were being interviewed. I remember a moment, you know, when one actually ate the apple, you know. And that was a Swiss journalist came to the house. This was just after the first, you know, civil rights and the police were bashing and so on. So it was sexy, Northern Ireland. And there was this Swiss journalist came to the house and said, "How do the intellectuals view all this?" And including me in. And really it was the first time I'd ever thought that there was, I mean, I scoffed, intellectuals? Quoi? And you can imagine, you know, mentioning this to Longley as the scorn of the group. I mean, that's one of the great fortifications of living in Belfast and growing up in it was scornfulness, you know, banter, debunking, the ferocity of the treatment you got to make sure again that you wouldn't raise the head too much.
Right.
So, but actually, from that moment on, the representative status, the canonization of the writer as something other than a maker of writings, but as an expression and commenter upon, or voice for, voice beside, or adjacent to the politics, that came on, and I can see what happened to myself. I mean, I began to write for the Listener. A very good editor in the Listener magazine in England, Carol Miller, always pursued me to write something about it, write about the North and so on. So we got entangled in that commentary business. We got involved in the area where you're not supposed to get involved. That is to say, if you're a writer, you're supposed to be a pure writer, no touchy politics, you know. But in fact, it's inevitable in Northern Ireland, I think, in Ireland, that writings do in some way involve that part of the mind and the common mind that is political. You can pretend that it doesn't, you know, but we went ahead and...
But I mean, in a sense, it'd be just too paradoxical for words if the writing was a testament to freedom, and then that the freedom was being suppressed at the level of citizen. I mean, that wouldn't make sense at all, in a way.
But it's the way people proceed.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it certainly is the way people proceed, I think. And I think it's always safer to proceed that way, you know.
Yeah, well, whatever you say nothing.
Yeah. But I mean, I have no real appetite for that kind of talk. But at the same time, I think that the game has to change.
Yeah.
And I think that just for all that has happened to happen, and then we just settle down with the same old structures in Belfast and in Dublin, and with culture meaning the BBC and the Arts Council. I don't know. There was a need to what do you say? Move the quilt.
Yeah, sure.
Pull the mat or whatever. Do something.
Yeah.
Create a bit of action. Maybe we should let the audience advance upon the microphone there, should we?
I think it's about time.
Not a question, but a request. Could you read alphabets for
Peter,
us? Yeah.
thank you. The request is to read a poem called Alphabets. All right. I read it last night, but I am not one to let that deter me. No, I don't mind talking. This is something that George was saying earlier on has relevance here. It's kind of widening out. It begins in the schoolroom, in the first schoolroom, up close to the thing, and then it widens to the second school, which was St. Colum's College, where the language moved from English, and I learned Irish and Latin, and learned the actual physical script of doing Irish script, which is associated, the letters in Irish alphabet are associated with trees. And then the third circle is the bigger school of in Harvard, I suppose, but also from being a student to being I'm a lecturer standing in the wooden O and so on. And the O widens from, it at one point in the poem towards the end, it is ovum, then it's the globe of the world. And so it's circles widening and widening and widening, or narrowing and narrowing, whatever. Alphabets. A shadow his father makes with joined hands and thumbs and fingers, nibbles on the wall like a rabbit's head. He understands, he will understand more when he goes to school. There he draws smoke with chalk the whole first week, then draws the forked stick that they call a Y. This is writing. A swan's neck and swan's back make the two he can see now as well as say. Two rafters and a cross tie on the slate are the letters some call A, some call A. There are charts, there are headlines, there is a right way to hold the pen and a wrong way. First it is copying out, and then English, marked correct with a little leaning hoe. Smells of inkwells rise in the classroom hush. A globe in the window tilts like a coloured O. Declension sang on air like a hosanna, as column after stratified column, book one of Elementa Latina, marbled and minatory, rose up on him. For he was fostered next in a stricter school, named for the patron saint of the oak wood, where classes switched to the pealing of a bell, and he left the Latin forum for the shade of new calligraphy that felt like home. The letters of this alphabet were trees, the capitals were orchards in full bloom, the lines of script like briars coiled in ditches. Here in her snooded garment and bare feet, all ringleted and assonance and wood notes, The poet's dream stole over him like sunlight and passed into the tenebrous thickets. He learns this other writing. He is the scribe who drove a team of quills on his white field. Round his cell door the blackbirds dart and dab. Then self-denial, fasting, the pure cold. By rules that hardened the farther they reached north, he bends to his desk and begins again. Christ's sickle has been in the undergrowth. The script grows bare and Merovingian. The globe has spun. He stands in a wooden O. He alludes to Shakespeare. He alludes to graves. Time has bulldozed the school and school window. Balers drop bales like printouts where stooked sheaves made lambdas on the stubble once at harvest, and the delta face of each potato pit was patted straight and moulded against frost. All gone, with the omega that kept watch above each door, the good luck horseshoe. Yet shape note language, absolute on air, as Constantine's sky lettered in hoc signo, can still command him. Or the necromancer who would hang from the domed ceiling of his house a figure of the world with colours in it, so that the figure of the universe, and not just single things, would meet his sight as he walked abroad. As from his small window, the astronaut sees all that he has sprung from, the risen, aqueous, singular, lucent O, like a magnified and buoyant ovum, or like my own wide, pre-reflective stare, all agog at the plasterer on his ladder, skimming our gable, and writing our name there with his trowel point, letter by strange letter.
I'd like to ask for digging for all the people who are here who didn't hear it last night, and for those who heard it and want to hear it again. Recite it.
Recite it. Between my finger and my thumb the squat pen rests, snug as a gun. Under my window a clean rasping sound when the spade sinks into gravelly ground, my father digging. I look down till his straining rump among the flower beds bends low, comes up 20 years away, stooping in rhythm through potato drills where he was digging. Coarse boot nestled on the lug, the shaft against the inside knee was levered firmly. He rooted out tall tops, buried the bright edge deep to scatter new potatoes that we picked, loving their cool hardness in our hands. My God, the old man could handle a spade. My grandfather cut more turf in a day than any other man on Toner's bog. Once I carried him milk in a bottle, corked sloppily with paper. He straightened up to drink it, then fell to right away, nicking and slicing neatly, heaving sods over his shoulder, going down and down for the good turf, digging. The cold smell of potato mold, the squelch and slap of soggy peat, the curt cuts of an edge through living roots awaken in my head. But I've no spade to follow men like them. Between my finger and my thumb the squat pen rests. I'll dig with it.
Last night you read from Station Island, and in the seventh section, I was reminded of a poem that I'm trying to write about someone who was killed, and it has a similar feeling. And I was wondering about, this is really personal, but if you got the details, if you made up the details, if the person who died, of how it happened, or where you found that out, And also in the end, where you ask for his forgiveness, and he says it's not his place to forgive. And if you were asking that for your own comfort, and if you were comforting yourself through it?
These are indeed stern questions. I made up the scenario, but I mean, I know the house where he lived, and I knew the story was that these police had come to the door asking him, as police, you know, to help, and he went to the door, and then he was shot. Because in Ulster, as in, shall we say, you could have imagined a situation some years or decades ago in southern states of the United States, where somebody could be a virulent, bigoted Klan member, but also be wearing the uniform of impersonal justice, in other words, a policeman. So that the hygiene of the uniform is no guarantee. I mean, you actually got the festering stuff underneath it. So I hadn't seen this man for a long time. I mean, I knew him. I mean, if I'd met him, you know, just. And in a sense, I wrote this in Dublin some years ago. I wrote it away from that situation. It was imagined. But part of the imagining was locating it, and I was imagining where it was happening. The whole poem of which it forms a part is a kind of self-examination and a self-accusation, and it's possibly too. It is a rhetorical device as well as an examination of conscience. So it is a poem, but that poem wasn't worked out. I mean, it worked itself out. This is one of the things that you want for a work. The given quality of this poem was that there would be certain encounters, certain figures, certain presences that would be conjured and I would encounter. And one of them I knew all along would be this man. My wife has a violent, but by now suppressed, rage at that, because she sees it, and I mean, of course it's true, she sees it as an intrusion into other people's grief. But except that it isn't one person, it's made up, you know, there's no names, but people who know what it's based on. But I would say that although I'm talking about a particular case, the poem is a general case. And I specifically don't in the poem mention whether it's the RUC, that it's the police that are doing the killing. This is another interesting question. If you have this generically true thing, people assume that it's the IRA. In England, if you read that poem, they assume it's the IRA killing somebody, because that is the usual thing that happens. People in the first circle in the north of Ireland know the situation, so they know what it means. However, if I had clearly placed the killers as being police people, the RUC, the poem would have taken on a kind of propagandist dimension, because the poem assumes, we assume that the poem is about what is generally true, you know. So then you would have been dubbing the RUC with the label of door-to-door killers. Now there were a couple of three in it, but they aren't usually that. They have problems, but they aren't as bad as that. So I felt that I would just leave it a general pattern of a murderer calling at the door and killing, and let people who know realize what is being commemorated. People who don't know read it as a poem. And I think that's the case in dealing with matters of political import. Politics in Northern Ireland and politics in El Salvador and politics in Iran and politics in Israel and South America, it's all spectator sport for most people, you know. And of course their concern is, I mean, it's necessary for us outside to be concerned, but the real energy is intimate. And I think that writing has to concern itself with the first circle, with the intimate place where everything is exact, rather than with the second or third circle where you are, where the big powers are watching and you're you're getting publicity. Poetry isn't to do with the publicity factor at all.
The Flyer, which is our local paper, and their little blurb about this had a whole page about you, and he sort of compared you and Yeats. What do you think about it? Because I go to high school and they think William Butler Yeats. They put him on some pedestal.
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, there's enormously good publicity, but it's quite inaccurate. I mean, Yeats is a great poet, greatest poet of this century, perhaps in English, perhaps in any other language. I'm not sure. He is a man of such enormous dimensions. His writing is a system. It's a whole theology as well as a set of images. He, from the age of about 20 until his 70s, he was creative, not just as a maker of lyrics, but as a founder of movements, as a visionary. His imagination established itself in prose, in plays, and if you open and take Yeats' poem, you are taking something out of a great system that has been created. So there's no question at all of comparison in that way. It is a mode of flattery and so on. I mention him because of his dimensions and because within our literary situation in Ireland, Yeats is a heroic figure. We can speak of him as a world author. He doesn't belong to the ghetto in that way, you know. But he espouses Ireland. He invented Ireland. You know, Oscar Wilde said Japan was invented by its artists, and Ireland, a certain Ireland, was invented by Yeats. What he invented most of all was scope. He invented a range of possibility. He changed the scale upon which the music was played, or he changed the scale in the architectural sense of what you could expect, what were the demands to be fulfilled. So in that case, he's a world maker, you know.
I just wanted to know how you came to writing poetry rather than using the novel or short stories or other forms of writing.
Well, it seemed to work. I mean, that's simple. I mean, it's true. I couldn't write. I wrote one short story as an undergraduate, but I couldn't believe in it. I didn't feel it had a biological right to exist. I just couldn't write. I just couldn't imagine in a way that would make a novel. I wanted a buzz, you know, immediately, which is what lyric poets write, partly because of the need for a high, you know. They're sprinters rather than marathon men. Prose is the real thing, you know. It's really much harder.
Now you're talking.
Yeah, it's yeah, it is. Yeah. I mean, it's a different world, and you really move the mass through the distance. So I mean, I'm just a weakling. I just couldn't do it. And also, when I was lucky that the first couple or three poems I wrote were actually published. You know, we know how important that sort of ascent is. Belfast Telegraph published a poem called Tractors. Never republished.
An evocative title.
Yes. They also, all right, this is finished up. They published one called Turkeys Observed because it was Christmas time. And then I sent them one about a sheep fair, which I thought was rather good, about sheep's wool stuffed through the slots of cribs. You know, I thought, terrific stuff. So the message came back from Tom Carson, who was then the literary editor of the Belfast Telegraph. I sent this in January. He said, sorry, no sheep fairs till May. The request is to read a poem called From the Republic of Conscience. This was it came about from a request from Amnesty International, the Sandymount branch of Amnesty, the local branch. And they wrote to me and said, would I write a poem for United Nations Day 1985? So I immediately wrote back and said, thanks very much, I'd really like to help and so on, but it's a kind of form of propaganda, and I've never really written for any group, and your cause is very good, but especially because of that reason, I don't think I should write for it, because it makes me sound like somebody riding the rails of decency and presenting myself as the supporter of good causes, blah, blah, blah. Yours sincerely. So having refused, I felt free. So this is the nearest thing to surrealism that I have ever committed. It's sort of made up. What would a country called conscience be like? As a matter of fact, there's one inaccuracy, because a conscience formed within the Roman Catholic dispensation should, strictly speaking, be a monarchy rather than a republic. But as I say, we secularize ourselves as best we can. I imagine it's a pretty salty place, pretty tart. When I landed in the Republic of Conscience, it was so noiseless when the engine stopped, I could hear a curlew high above the runway. At immigration, the clerk was an old man who produced a wallet from his homespun coat and showed me a photograph of my grandfather. The woman in customs asked me to declare the words of our traditional cures and charms to heal dumbness and divert the evil eye. No porters, no interpreter, no taxi. You carried your own burden, and very soon your symptoms of creeping privilege disappeared. Fog is a dreaded omen there, but lightning spells universal good, and parents hang swaddled infants in clothes during thunderstorms. Salt is their precious mineral, and seashells are held to the ear during births and funerals. The base of all inks and pigments is sea water. Their sacred symbol is a stylized boat. The sail is an ear, the mast a sloping pen, the hull a mouth shape, the keel an open eye. At their inauguration, public leaders must swear to uphold unwritten law and weep to atone for their presumption to hold office, and to affirm their faith that all life sprang from salt in tears which the sky god wept after he dreamt his solitude was endless. I came back from that frugal republic with my 2 arms the one length, the customs woman having insisted my allowance was myself. The old man rose and gazed into my face and said that was official recognition that I was now a dual citizen. He therefore desired me when I got home to consider myself a representative and to speak on their behalf in my own tongue. Their embassies, he said, were everywhere, but operated independently, and no ambassador would ever be relieved. Thank you. That's actually that's as much a result of reading Eastern European poetry in translation as it is a result of an invitation from Amnesty International, of course. Well, a couple of people have asked me to, I have these sonnets in memory of my mother, which a couple of people have mentioned to me, and maybe I'll do some that I didn't do last night. Fear of affectation made her affect inadequacy whenever it came to pronouncing words beyond her. Bertolt Brecht. She'd managed something hampered and askew every time, as if she might betray the hampered and inadequate by too well adjusted a vocabulary. With more challenge than pride, she'd tell me, "You know all them things." So I governed my tongue in front of her, a genuinely well-adjusted, adequate betrayal of what I knew better. I'd know and and decently relapse into the wrong grammar, which kept us allied and at bay. There you are now. In the first flush of the Easter holidays, the ceremonies during Holy Week were high points in our sons and lovers' phase. The midnight fire, the Paschal candlestick, elbow to elbow, glad to be kneeling next to each other up there near the front of the packed church. We would follow the text and rubrics for the blessing of the font. As the hind longs for the streams, so my soul. Dippings, towelings, the water breathed on, the water mixed with chrism and with oil, cruet tinkle, formal insensation, and the psalmist's outcry taken up with pride. Day and night my tears have been my bread. In the last minutes he said more to her, almost than in all their life together. You'll be in New Row on Monday night and I'll come up for you, and you'll be glad when I walk in the door. Isn't that right? His head was bent down to her propped up head. She couldn't hear, but we were overjoyed. He called her good and girl. Then she was dead. The searching for a pulse beat was abandoned, and we all knew one thing by being there. The space we stood around had been emptied into us to keep. It penetrated clearances that suddenly stood open. High cries were felled, and a pure change happened. I'd just do a lighter one, and we can conclude. This is called a peacock's feather. And I think after such an unconscionable flourish of self, the emblem of the peacock's feather is a reminder. I went to England. Well, we all went actually, my wife and 2 kids. So we arrived with my sister-in-law at her family home, and we had forgotten that they had a youngster about 4 or 5 weeks before. We had come without any present for this one, and my wife said, "Go upstairs and write something for her." As you know, as the woman in question, there's going to be no disobedience in that case. Anyway, I couldn't really, there's nothing to write. I mean, sure, good idea, but what? So we're walking around the place, and we actually found a peacock's feather on the lawn, and I just went, something we can do with this. We can do something with this. We'll present this and wrap it up in a poem. That's the command, isn't it? Wrap it up in a poem. Okay, wrapping it up now. A peacock's feather for Daisy Garnett, a little girl called Daisy. 6 days ago the water fell to christen you, to work its spell, and wipe your slate, we hope, for good. But now your life is sleep and food, which with the touch of love suffice, you Daisy, Daisy, English niece. Gloucestershire, its prospects lie wooded and misty to my eye, whose landscape, like your mother's was, is other than this mellowness of topiary, lawn and brick, possessed, untrespassed, walled, nostalgic. I come from scraggy farm and moss, old patchworks that the pitch and toss of history have left dishevelled. But here, for your sake, I have levelled my cart-track voice to garden tones, cobbled the bog with Cotswold stones. Ravelling strands of families mesh in love knots of two minds, one flesh. The future is not our own. We'll weave an in-law maze, we'll nod and wave with trust, but little intimacy. So this is a billet doux to say that in a warm July you lay, christened and smiling in Bradley, while I, a guest in your green court, at a west window sat and wrote, self-consciously, in gathering dark. I might as well be in Cool Park. So before I leave your ordered home, let us pray. May tilth and loam, darkened with Celts and Saxons' blood, breastfeed your love of house and wood, where I drop this for you as I pass, like the peacock's feather on the grass.